Hello, recruit, and welcome to Astroneer Academy 204 Base Building. Our courses to date have been mostly instructional, packed with information about how to complete specific missions or how to avoid letting the plant with a bad attitude send you off for a reprint. Today's course will be a bit different as we shift our discussion towards more general theories. Our topic today is one that simply does not lend itself to having a set of specific tasks that will guarantee success in building out your own base. That is because each base is as unique as the Astroneer building it, with various bases serving a multitude of different purposes. In light of this, it can become difficult to even define the scope of our discussion, but let's give it a try. For our purpose today, we will seek to offer best practices for building your first base of operations. Our goal will be to include all production modules that we have discussed to date, explore the layout of an efficient power network, and provide pointers for keeping everything organized, all while keeping future expansion and aesthetics in mind. Before we get into all of that though, it is a good idea to begin by creating a large, flat area to build your base. While it is not absolutely necessary, flattening the terrain where you wish to build your base can be beneficial to creating a nice, clean layout. Platforms can be difficult to align when the terrain is not flat, and certain mission-related items that we will discuss in later courses can be askew to the rest of your base if not placed on a level surface. It's a good idea to flatten the terrain before you begin placing platforms and modules due to the physics of the terrain itself. When you manipulate the terrain around a platform, the platform can become unlocked and sometimes even move quite a bit. You can avoid this frustration by flattening the terrain first, then placing your platforms. When it comes to flattening out a large area to be nice and level, it is important to keep going until you have flattened all of the terrain you wish to cover. If you are hoping to flatten a very large area, you may find that the oxygen supply in your backpack becomes a limiting factor. You can avoid this by either placing a tether network in a rough outline of the area you wish to flatten, or by simply parking a vehicle or two near the outer boundary of this area. Power can also be a limiting factor if you're flattening a large area if you have any active terrain tool augments consuming power. While a wide mod can definitely speed up the process of flattening a large area of terrain, it will also drain your backpack battery unless you're connected to a tether network or you are carrying a power producer. The final bit of prep work to take into consideration when flattening terrain for a base is the soil itself. No, not the soil on the ground, though that does come into play here. I mean soil that you carry in your backpack in a soil canister. Take a moment to survey the terrain you wish to flatten. If most of it is below the level of the dark terrain of your starting shelter, you will most likely want to create several extra soil canisters and fill them with soil before you begin. There are few things more frustrating than when you just want to flatten a new area for your base but run out of soil before you can finish. You may also wish to carry several empty soil canisters if a large portion of the area you intend to flatten will be cutting into terrain that has a higher elevation. You will be removing a lot of soil in that scenario, and you may as well collect it for later use in your soil centrifuge. If there is an even mix of terrain both below and above the elevation of the dark terrain surrounding your starting shelter, then you may not need to carry more than one soil canister. With all of these best practices in mind, let's begin leveling the terrain for our base. That brings up a pro tip from Bunny on how to pick a spot to begin leveling. Deploy your terrain tool and align the edges of its reticle with the edge of the 2 feet to either side of the door on your starting shelter. Picking this as your starting spot will make it easier to go back and level additional terrain to the same plane if you need to do so later. If you pick a random spot to begin leveling, it will be fairly difficult to ensure you can resume leveling additional terrain to that same plane at a later time. With your starting spot selected and your terrain tool set to flatten, begin flattening the area around your starting shelter, then work out to the edges of where you wish your base to reside. Remember, once you start flattening, don't stop, as this will help you get a nice, consistent level across the entire area. As you move further away from your starting shelter, the soil that can be added while flattening is probably beginning to rise above the surrounding natural terrain. This occurs due to the fact that the natural terrain roughly follows the curvature of the planet, while the terrain you are leveling is holding the plane you selected when you begin flattening. You can avoid having the edges of your base rising far above the surrounding terrain in a couple of different ways. The first is to keep things in proportion. By that I mean try to avoid flattening terrain in one direction only. Try to spread your area out, keeping the starting shelter near the center. Second, you can mask this effect somewhat by flattening out hills that rise above the terrain surrounding your starting shelter. And third, if you do feel you simply must have an absolutely huge area flattened out, you may consider creating multiple tiers at different levels to offset this effect. That brings us to another quick pro tip. If you are considering flattening at a large hill or even part of a mountain, use a vehicle with a drill attached to remove the majority of the hill or mountain first, then fine-tune it when you're flattening the remainder of the area with your terrain tool. The drill on a rover can remove significantly more terrain than your terrain tool, so you will wind up spending less time cutting into the hillside or mountain. Before we move on from terrain, I want to pick back up on an idea first introduced way back in Astroneer Academy 103 when we introduced terrain tool augments. Using the inhibitor mod in conjunction with a terrain analyzer and a soil canister with some soil in it will allow you to turn that dull gray soil you just flattened into something more vibrant. You can refer back to that extra course for Astroneer Academy 103 if you need a refresher on how to set the colors stored in a terrain analyzer. Once you have your color set, however, be sure the inhibitor mod and the terrain analyzer are both equipped on your terrain tool and turned on. As long as you have some soil in a soil canister on your backpack or terrain tool, you can set your terrain tool to its Add Terrain mode and begin adding color to that dull gray terrain. You may find that this creates a slightly uneven surface and that any platforms in the area will become unlocked and might even move a bit. The result, however, is well worth the effort. You can get really creative and use several colors to create a pattern, an image, or just try to replicate the surrounding natural terrain. We will revisit using terrain colors again in Astroneer Academy 304. Now that you have some terrain flattened, there are a few factors you will want to keep in mind as you begin to think about how you want to lay out your first base. As your base grows over time, adding more and more production modules, your power needs will grow as well. You will also find that your need for storage space will grow as you expand into creating more advanced modules and vehicles. Planning for this growth ahead of time can help you avoid the frustration of needing to tear everything down later to make room for expansion. Granted, there is nothing wrong with tearing it all down and starting over. In fact, you shouldn't be afraid of doing this at all, as each time you build a new base layout, you will learn more about how everything works together and help you identify your own priorities in base building. In fact, that latter point is probably the most important. Unless you regularly have fellow Astroneers joining you in your adventure, you are the one who will be using your base. If your layout works for you, then you've done it right. You will not only want to take future expansion into consideration, but you will also want to decide which power producers you wish to use for your new base. If you plan on relying on solar, then you will want to avoid placing your power producers near the side of a mountain or a dense forest. Both of these can block sunlight for a portion of the day, limiting the amount of power your solar panels can produce. If you're going to utilize wind power, you will most likely want to spread your power production facilities out a bit. Why? Well, if you think back to Astroneer Academy 104, we discussed how wind can be blowing in one area while just a few feet away it's not blowing at all. By spreading out wind turbines, you will increase your chances of producing power when the wind blows. If you plan on using small or medium generators as your primary source of power, you will want to plan some storage space in your power production facilities to accommodate the fuel those generators require. With these considerations in mind, and a nice flat area to build on, let's move on to identifying some key elements of building your base. There are no set rules that say you have to clearly define each area, but for the sake of our discussion today, we are going to break everything down into 4 main areas within your base: power production facilities, research, resource production and printing, and storage. To get us started with power production facilities, let's complete a few missions that will reward you with some nice power items. First up is medium battery. You collected at least 3 lithium in Astroneer Academy 202, so let's put one of those plus 1 zinc to good use and make a medium battery. If you need a refresher on the medium battery, head back to Astroneer Academy 104, otherwise, create your medium battery, then head to the mission log and claim your rewards of a large wind turbine and a large solar panel. Note that this mission does not unlock the schematics for either of these items, so if you wish to produce others in the future, you will first need to spend some bytes in the research catalog. You can also review the materials from Astroneer Academy 104 for all of the details on each of these large power producers. With the medium battery mission completed, we are going to move on to creating one of the most expensive items in the research catalog, the RTG, by way of the high-tech Spec mission. We created the nanocarbon alloy in an Astroneer Academy 202 extra, so you should have the resources on hand to create another if you've already used it. Hopefully you have the 12,500 bytes to unlock the RTG in the research catalog. With the schematic unlocked, combine your nanocarbon alloy with lithium on a small printer and create an RTG. Then head to the mission log and claim your rewards of a QT RTG and 2 more medium batteries. With the rewards from these 2 missions, your power production facilities just received a nice glow up. While we're spending a lot of research bytes, let's complete one more mission: Unlocked Potential. Go ahead, spend those bytes. Splurge on some nice things for your base. You want that extra large platform C? Treat yourself. How about an extra large wind turbine? Treat yourself. Maybe you want to unlock the tall platform to add some lighting to your base? Treat yourself. Keep spending those bytes until you have unlocked 100 items in the research catalog, then claim your reward from the mission log at a landing pad, an additional QT RTG. It is the best day of the year. Now that you have several more power producers, let's get to work determining where you should deploy your power production facility. Not to put too fine of a point on it, but there are not really any wrong ways to go about this. There are a few best practices you can keep in mind, however. As long as you're not relying on generators as your primary power source, your power production facility does not need to be all that close to your shelter or other areas of your base. You can place at least one platform with power producers closer to your shelter to ensure its power cable can reach the rest of your power network, but that is not really necessary. You can use extenders set to network power to allow you to place your power production facility as far away as you wish. As we discussed in Astroneer Academy 104, you can consolidate small and medium power producers onto storage on a single platform to save both space and resources. If you're using solar, it is best to keep everything flat, which can limit your storage options. If you do choose to attach it to vertical storage options or platforms, just remember that you may be limiting the amount of time the solar panels are producing power, as they may not be able to receive sunlight as often when they are stored vertically. If you are using small or medium generators, it's a good idea to attach those to a platform that also contains storage filled with the fuel they require, as this means you won't have to refuel them manually every 120 seconds. In Astroneer Academy 303, we will discuss how you can use various automation items to control generators so they only operate at times when other power producers are offline. The next area that you will want to consider for your base is another one that does not necessarily need to be the most accessible. Most research will take several minutes, with some research items requiring an hour or more to complete. Since the research chamber can automatically pull a new research item or object into itself when it finishes one, you might not need to touch your research chamber for hours at a time. That is why it does not need to occupy a central spot in your first base. I tend to locate my first research chamber off to one end of my power production area, sometimes using it as a means of connecting multiple platforms of wind turbines together. Once I obtain a new unique structure that we will discuss in Astroneer Academy 205, I usually relocate my research chamber near that structure in an attempt to use the platform holding the research chamber to extend my power network to that new structure. Not to get too far ahead, but that structure is a laboratory, so in my mind at least, it's a natural fit to have my research occurring nearby. Another reason you may wish to place your research area away from a central location in your first base is that you might find you want to add additional research chambers to speed up the rate you're earning research bytes. By having it off to one side and out of the way, you can easily add a few more research chambers without needing to move other items out of the way. Wherever you choose to locate your research area, try to place your research chamber or chambers on a platform with enough extra storage slots to store a few unpackaged research items. That will enable you to queue up several research items at once so the research chamber can automatically pull them. This will give you more free time to go about completing other missions and enjoying your adventure without needing to check back on the research chamber every 10 minutes or so. The next area for your base could arguably be broken down into two separate areas, but since they both fall into production of some sort, I'm grouping them together. Your resource production and printer area is probably one you will want to give the most thought to. When you are at your base, you are most likely spending your time producing something. Whether you're using a smelter to refine natural resources or printing new modules or vehicles, you spend a good deal of time in this area. So, what goes into the production area? At the very least, you will have 4 main modules: a soil centrifuge, smelting furnace, chemistry lab, and probably an atmospheric condenser. For printing, you will want to have at least one of each printer, though I think a good argument can be made for having at least 2 each of the small and medium printers. As you progress further and further into your adventure, you will often find that you want to print more than one of a certain item at once. When that happens, having 2 of the small and medium printers cuts your time spent waiting on printers in half. There are a whole host of platforms that you can employ to hold the production modules at your first base, and we will cover those more in depth in next week's Astroneer Academy Extra. Efficiency really becomes the key thing to keep in mind when selecting your platforms. For example, while you certainly can fit all 3 of your printers onto a single large platform B, that would not be the most efficient use of your space. With all 3 printers attached to that platform, you only leave a single small Tier 1 storage slot available. Nearly everything you will print requires 2 or more resource nuggets, however, so this layout would mean you will have to carry the required resources in your backpack. If you want to print several things that require 3 or even 4 resources, your backpack is going to fill up quickly and you may find that you're running back and forth to pick up more resources to feed into the printers. A better solution would be to either use a much larger platform or break the printers out onto their own platforms. This will provide ample open storage slots, allowing you to simply place storage that contains the required resources onto the platforms so the printer can automatically pull those resources as needed. Your soil centrifuge, smelting furnace, and chemistry lab all need a bit of space as well, otherwise they can quickly become high maintenance. Early on, you'll find that a large platform B works well for each of these modules. The production module sits comfortably in the center, leaving a medium tier 2 slot to either side for you to place soil canisters or natural resource, while also leaving space for the resources each of these modules will produce. Attaching storage to those medium slots will greatly expand that storage area, making their usage even more efficient. Your atmospheric condenser is a key part of your production area, as many composites require these atmospheric resources for production in the chemistry lab. That does not mean your atmospheric condenser needs to occupy a prominent location in your production area, however. Nor does it mean it will ultimately need a lot of storage space. Because of this, I tend to keep my atmospheric condenser off to one side or just behind my main production area. When used in conjunction with the medium gas canister we discussed in Astroneer Academy 202, you can turn it on and let it fill up the medium gas canister while you go about other tasks. Also, keep in mind that our discussion today is focused on your first base, and most of the time that means we're talking about a base on Silva. It is possible to begin your adventure on other planets, but we will not be discussing those options for several weeks. Since we are on Silva, you can only collect 2 gases, hydrogen and nitrogen. Because of this, you simply really do not need to dedicate a huge amount of space for your atmospheric condenser in your first base. You might be wondering why I haven't included the shredder and the trade platform in the production area discussion. If you think back to the Astroneer Academy 202 Extra, I suggested keeping your shredder off to one side of your base to avoid accidentally shredding items. There are a few feelings worse than unintentionally placing your brand new storage silo into the shredder, especially if it was full of resources. I suppose the only thing worse would be unintentionally placing dynamite into your shredder. Trust me, you do not want that to happen. For me, I tend to locate a shredder and the trade platform somewhere out of the way, but still easily accessible to both my production area and my storage area. This keeps it close enough to be convenient for various tasks, but at a safe distance to avoid accidents. You will most likely want to expand your production area as you progress in your adventure, so try to keep that in mind as you decide where everything is going to go. While you might not have the resources required to jump right to an extended setup when you're first starting out, having a good idea of where and how you want to expand over time will help you plan out things in the beginning to make the inevitable expansion much simpler. We will talk more about base expansion in 2 weeks in another Astroneer Academy Extra. The final area of your first base that we need to discuss today is storage. Let's get one big thing out of the way right up front. Do not use storage holes. They're bad, like really bad. Our training simulation not only has to calculate the physics of every item you chuck into a storage hole, but it has to calculate the physics of the items colliding into one another while in the storage hole. On top of that, the training simulation also has to animate all of this storage hole mess. Even if everything seems to be resting perfectly in your storage hole, the training simulation is still hard at work behind the scenes doing all of those calculations and animations. That can be taxing on the hardware running the training simulation, leading to poor performance in your adventure. On top of that, the training simulation is not perfect. Objects sitting on the ground can sometimes inexplicably fall through the ground, never to be seen again. Items thrown into the storage hole are prime candidates for this disappearing act. You can avoid this hit to performance and keep your items from disappearing by simply taking the time to utilize proper storage. When an item is properly secured to a storage slot, the training simulation has far less work to do behind the scenes for physics and animations, which increases performance. Likewise, storage that is attached to platforms is unlikely to disappear when you aren't looking. So don't use storage holes. They're bad. Like, really bad. Early on in your adventure, you will not need to devote a lot of space to storage. You will be using most of the resources you collect to produce other items, so you may be able to get away with simply using any free storage in your production area. As you progress through your adventure, you will quickly find that you have a lot of stuff that needs somewhere to go. Various mission rewards, extra resources, and even items you may no longer be using all need a home. So where do you put it all? Into a well thought out storage area. That's where. As with most things in your first base, there are some key points to keep in mind when planning out a storage area. The foremost is to think about what it is you want to store and how often you will need to access it. For resources, it's a good idea to store them in close proximity to both your production area and your landing pad. When you return to Silva after collecting resources from another planet, you can quickly unload those resources into your storage area if it's close to the landing pad. Likewise, when you need those resources for production, you can easily move them where you need them. It's not a bad idea to leave a bit of space around the resource storage portion of your storage area so you can easily drive a rover into this area. In fact, it's probably a good idea to leave enough space for your rover to move throughout your production area as well. Leaving enough space for your rover means you can quickly load and unload resources and other objects that you've been carrying on your rover, saving time by preventing a lot of unnecessary walking back and forth. You will most likely want a spot to store items you do not use frequently or that have been replaced by something else. This storage area does not need to be centrally located, so you can feel free to place it out of the way, off to one side, or an unused portion of an area you flattened earlier. The main thing here to remember is visibility. If you cram all of these unused items together in a compact space, it may be difficult to locate them if you do need them again. Keeping them visible also helps you remember that they exist in the first place, meaning you are less likely to waste resources by creating a duplicate of something you already have. Keeping a good line of sight to everything stored in this area will also help if friends join you in your adventure. They can easily take a look to these items to find things that might be useful to them during their time visiting you. Finally, keeping lesser used items organized and visible can help you identify which items you may wish to eliminate entirely. I know I have personally seen several bundles of tethers sitting in storage, and eventually it dawns on me I can throw those into the shredder and get some scrap that I can use to trade for something I will actually use. Speaking of tethers, you can help improve the look of your base by taking a bit of time to pick up tethers that are no longer in use. If you ran a tether line out into a distant field to gather resin, but you've completely depleted that resin deposit, those tethers are no longer all that useful. Additionally, once you have vehicles or a portable oxygenator, tethers are no longer the mandatory lifeline they were early in your adventure. When you pick up the tethers, they will be placed back into tether packs that you can then store to use later as you explore a new planet, or you can just shred them entirely. Trust me, your base will look a lot better without a bunch of tether lines running out in every possible random direction. Our final thing to consider in building your first base also falls squarely into the aesthetics category: lighting and decorating. Lighting is going to come from one of two sources: a work light or a floodlight. The work light is unlocked from the beginning of your adventure and can be printed on your backpack or small printer from 1 copper. The floodlight was unlocked when you completed the Talking Tungsten mission in Astroneer Academy 202, and it can be produced on the same 2 printers from 1 tungsten. If, for some reason, you have not yet completed the Talking Tungsten mission, it will require 2,000 bytes to unlock its schematic in the research catalog. Both of these lights can be freestanding and will feature 2 power cable plugs. The floodlight is not actually all that useful to help light up your base when it is freestanding on the ground, as its light will simply be shining up into the sky. You can attach it to walls and ceilings made of terrain, however. Both lights can also be slotted to small tier 1 or larger storage slots, and both require power, though they do not actually consume any, in order for them to light up. You can also turn both light sources off and on as needed. There are even a couple of platforms that we will look at next week that work really well as light poles. The main differences between the 2 lights are the type of light they emit. The work light tends to emit a glowing light that softly illuminates the surrounding area, while the floodlight is more focused and will only really illuminate the area directly in front of it. Lighting goes a long way to help brighten up your base, both literally and figuratively. While the darkness of night isn't really all that dark in our training simulation, having a well-lit base goes a long way to not only making it feel complete, but also a bit more warm and inviting. You don't even have to invest resources to create lights if you don't want to. In fact, every single work light and floodlight that you see here in the Astroneer Academy base was found in discarded backpacks and on debris scattered about the surface of Silva. You can also incorporate items from limited time events along with other collectible items to help bring a bit of character and charm to your base. We will discuss such items in Astroneer Academy 305. While lighting and decoration do not bring any added functionality to your base, they do help it to have a bit more warmth. I would encourage you to spend the time and the resources to add a bit of lighting and decoration to your base. You will not only have a much more pleasant place to work, but you will also have something to be proud of when your friends come to visit. Today's course has been one of our longest yet, simply because having a well-designed first base can make a huge difference when it comes to enjoying your adventures. You have learned about several things to keep in mind when designing your own base to ensure that it is not only efficient, but that it is a pleasant place to be. In the coming 2 weeks, we will investigate all of the various platforms and storage options that you can use in your base, along with discussing other types of bases you can build and some best practices to use if you decide you want to relocate your base. Until then, I'm Brandon, reminding you to keep looking to the stars.